Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's webinar. My name is Philip Reese from ByteCubed, and I really want to take this time to thank everyone for coming to participate. This webinar is the second in a series of workshops delivered in this webinar format. The first three workshops are designed to assist you with both your understanding and preparation of key elements of your 18.2 and 18.B SBIR STTR BAA submission. Today's workshop topic focuses on the technology transition process. Please limit today's questions to the scope of this workshop topic. Next slide. Today we're going to focus on two key areas. First is providing an overview of what transition is and why it's relevant to the SBIR process. Then we'll have a panel of experts from within and outside government who can give you best practices for commercialization. Next slide. Workshop objectives. The goal of this workshop is to learn how to best position your technology as a successful transition candidate. We want you to gain an understanding of the technology transition process, determine what makes a good transition candidate, and learn how to include transition considerations in your proposals. Next slide, please. As a reminder, all participant microphones are muted for the duration of the webinar. Today's workshop is structured as follows: a presentation, panel discussion, Q&A, and a post-workshop survey. At the end of this webinar, you will be automatically redirected to a page where you'll be asked to provide some feedback regarding today's workshop. It should take you less than 10 minutes to complete this survey. We will also send the survey to the email you use to register. For questions during the presentation, please click on the blue question mark located at the top of the page.
You trying to connect to the webinar, you need the telephone number, sir?
If you are unable to pose your question during the workshop, please send an email to sbirtraining@bytecube.com within 1 day of the workshop. Again, that email is sbirtraining@bytecube.com. All responses to questions will be addressed and distributed via email within 10 business days following the conclusion of the workshop. Next slide, please. Today, we are joined by DoD, SBIR, and STTR presenters and panelists with vast experience. I'd like to request that each speaker state their name, organization, and role prior to sharing their remarks. And also, as a reminder, please say next slide as we continue through the process. Next slide, please. I'd first like to turn it over to AJ Yarmy from Janet International to talk us through an overview of what is transition. AJ, please unmute your microphone and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. This is AJ Yarmy, and I'm the owner of Janet International, a business development consulting firm. And I've had quite a bit of experience with technology transition, both in assisting clients as well as with working directly for companies. I've got my start in SBIRs back in the late 90s. So, successfully in Phase Is, Phase IIs, Phase IIIs. So from a technology transition perspective, it's a term that is kind of a catch-all, but it moves technology forward from a lab into some type of acquisition program. Now, frequently it's interchanged with commercialization, and with that, it doesn't mean that you're only applying it to the government and acquisition and military operations, but also other types of commercial opportunities as well. So part of the transition from the government perspective is they want to see a success. They want to see something come out of it. Ideally, it's for an original purpose that was intended. But obviously, if you can sell more of these products that you've created, then you can go ahead and make more money, the costs come down, and it's kind of a win-win all around for everybody. So it's not just going into a program executive office or a program office, but also looking at primes within the DoD, within other government organizations and agencies, and then also commercial applications. And I think everybody kind of knows that there's a lot more commercial customers out there potentially than there are military. But there's some barriers to entry and there's some learning curve involved. So overall, technology transition, moves things from the idea that's in your head to something that's much more tangible, starting with the military and the government, and potentially going elsewhere as well. Next slide, please.
Great, thanks, AJ. Now I'd like to turn over to Glenn from the Army to talk us through transition paths and government programs of record. Glenn, please unmute your microphone and take it away.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Glenn Weaver, and I am a support contractor with the Army SBIR program. My role is to manage the Army's team of technical assistance advocates. And our primary role is to assist the small businesses with doing technology transition and commercialization. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. In 2015, the Government Accounting Office published a study on DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, where they focused on how effective they were at doing technology transition. What the study found was that the most important factors for successful transition was, first, a military or commercial demand for that technology, or second, a clear linkage into some other research area. So the challenge to all of us and to the small businesses is to identify these pathways for the SBIR topics that we're working on. Sometimes it's very easy. You read the topic or you talk to the government sponsors and there's a very clear program already laid out and in mind. But often it's not. Often it is being R&D. The end state for the technology is sometimes not very clearly stated, and so the challenge is to figure that out. So you can think of it this way, as the three broad groups of transition paths. You can sell directly into the government. You can sell as a vendor or a subcontractor to a government prime contractor, or you can sell into the commercial markets. So today I'd just like to focus on the first two, selling directly to the government and as a sub through a prime. So the government, if you sell directly into the government, you need to rather much understand who the different organizations are. And since WIS is the Department of Defense, I'll concentrate on that. So frequently, the next transition step in one of our SBIR topics is simply moving into another R&D area, another follow-on R&D effort. And so the military communities all have a science and technology or an R&D component. The organization varies somewhat according to, from agency to agency, but they all have somebody who serves that role. And usually these groups are very good about publishing and making their R&D objectives and strategies available to everybody. And they publish a lot and they go around to a lot of symposiums. And so that's a good way to find out, to sort of look into that aspect. The acquisition and the sustainment sides of the program, these are the things we often call programs of record. And my experiences would be finding information about programs of record is much harder to crack. The communities tend to be more close-lipped, and because they are in the middle of solicitations and RFPs, you typically don't have that much access. These programs typically take about 3 or 5 years to take shape, and they often include some type of a competition or a shoot-off, and the nature of the acquisition programs is that they generally go to that list of companies that you think of as the DoD primes, because they're often large enough and complex enough that these are the companies that rather much specialized can do that. So the transition strategy, a good transition strategy, should be always looking at forming relationship with these prime contractors. Now, the larger DoD contractors, they have dedicated teams, and by the ones I'm talking, like companies like Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. They have teams that are dedicated to look at the SBIR program, and identify topics and contractors that match up against their own strategic interests. So it's a good idea also to reach out to them. As far as putting a proposal together, I think it's always well, not always, but it's very often to your benefit to have a prime contractor in your hip pocket when you go in with your Phase II proposal as sort of a transition partner. That's absolutely not necessary in the evaluation criteria, but it is a good selling point. And that can also occur later in the technology, as the technology begins to evolve. But my tip is earlier is always better in this case. Get aligned with the program, get aligned with primes if that's the path that you need to do. Next slide, please. So the programs of record, again, these are programs that are in the budget. They are put forward as a line item in the budget. They have specific dollars and timelines and milestones associated with them. This is a good way to do what all good marketers do, which is follow the money. If you can figure out where the acquisition programs are and know which ones you're feeding into, that's always a key advantage as well. Philip, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. And with that, I'll turn it back to AJ for the next slides. AJ, please unmute yourself and continue.
Thank you. So understanding technology readiness levels, or TRLs, is pretty key to achieving success in terms of transitioning your technology and getting to full productization or commercialization. So everybody kind of starts out with an idea, and they think that, well, it's a great idea, it's better than sliced bread. If I want it, if I buy it, everybody will buy it. There'll be a path to my door. But I think, as most of you that are in here now know, that's not quite true in terms of dealing with the government, because the government doesn't buy the idea, they actually buy the end product. And so you've got to go ahead and mature your technology to get there. So one of the problems that people frequently, misdiagnose when they're doing a self-analysis is that they really are not ready for prime time. So in order to start getting the program officers interested, the primes interested, you've got to have something tangible to show. A lot of times you can bring them in and give them a lab demonstration, or go out and have a meeting. But the problem is that, again, you still need some development to get to where it will really get their interest and they can really visualize it involved in their program or on their platform. So that's one of the things that you have to understand from the TRL standpoint. The other thing is, when you get to that TRL 6 point, typically that's where you start experiencing the valley of death, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of some of the later slides. But what happens is you have to be able to actually test out your product and prove its viability and continue to mature it out TRL-wise. And there's a number of reasons also why sometimes people run into that cliff. We'll get into more detail on that later. So basically what you're trying to do with TRLs is you're trying to reduce the risk, not just from your perspective and your product's perspective, but also from the government's perspective. And the more mature it gets, the less risk there is, and the more easily, and I'm using that term a little bit loosely, but the more easily it will transition. So next slide, please. So again, one of the problems well, there's actually several problems that we've seen in terms of transition, is you get to that TRL 6 level in the end of your Phase II, and then sometimes the path forward has become a little bit muddied and not quite as clear as it was when you started. So what happens is occasionally programs change, requirements may have changed in terms of need from the government side, and even the priorities have shifted. In some government program offices, maybe the advocate that you had backing you initially and had that interest and embraced what you were doing, maybe they've changed assignments, so they've moved out and somebody new is in, and they just don't quite have the same mindset that was there before. So regardless, however, the reason why the government started down that path with you is real, is viable, and occasionally, if the things shift a little bit in terms of transitioning beyond the TRL 6, what's going to happen is there may be other opportunities within the government, the DoD and agencies. So basically, there's other ways to go ahead and continue to develop and mature your technology that are alongside the SBIR itself. So with that, we've got a number of other different types of opportunities and solicitations and funding sources here that, depending upon the nature of where you are with your technology, you can go ahead and qualify for some of those, and you can get additional funding to continue to develop things out. So that will continue to move things along from an acquisition standpoint. Sometimes you have to go on a bit of a parallel path, again, if the original need went away. Other times you can continue to mature it, and now that you've hit the point where you have something that is much more viable, much more mature, and hence much more of interest, then you can go ahead and get back onto the original path and back into the program offices that officers that may have originally sponsored it. Next slide, please. So some of the actually, could you go back? I actually missed a few things. So again, one of the things that you can do here in the transition and acquisition standpoint as well was that, and another way to continue development is that occasionally when you're trying to develop something larger that's a system or a larger component, there may be aspects of it that are little spin-outs or of interest. So again, what they can do is they may be able to fall into one of these other funding opportunities, so you can still continue to develop it out, and then that becomes an additional opportunity. One is you can continue to advance the technology for your primary product that you're working on, but you may have a secondary spin-out product that you can use and do successfully for revenue generation as well. And as long as it's within the SBIR charter and within the topic, and also you reference it within your proposal, what happens is it can be a win for you. It can actually be a secondary way of going out there and getting on programs and getting funding. I'm sorry, on to the next slide, please. So as far as transition challenges, I'd mentioned a few of them that are out there, but the biggest one is that there is no one-size-fits-all for products and technology and transition and commercialization. There is no one single solution that you can put everywhere. So the other thing that people sometimes don't realize is that obtaining funding is difficult. So with that, what happens is, we talked about the valley of death, and it's occasionally more than a valley of death. It could be a cliff and a chasm, and sometimes you're just kind of falling off of it. So the trick is to try to figure out ways to go ahead and bridge that. So a lot of the problems that people have is they don't really know where they are in relation to that valley of death. So what you need to do is you need to be talking to your point of contact on the SBIR. You need to be maintaining communication and kind of getting a feel of where you are. Additionally, the more mature you have the product, the easier it is to transition as you're getting that constant interactive feedback going back and forth. So another point here is that when you're starting from scratch with a new customer, you're creating a relationship. I mean, that's you've got the interpersonal type relationship aspect of it. You've got the kind of a business development, and obviously you have the technology aspect of it. So you have a number of different, everything ranging from speed bumps to barriers, where you've got to go ahead and get them to know you and sell yourself, sell your technology, sell your company, and move things along. The other thing that people frequently do not probably do as good a job on the homework as they should is that you have to match the need with your capabilities. And so typically what I talk to people about is, you already know what's in your own head. It's obviously very clear. You kind of know your direction. You've been mulling this over for a while. But where they fail is you really don't know what's in your customer's head or your prospect's head. So what you have to do is really understand how, not just talking from a technical capability, but looking at it from a solution, solving the problem, solving the need, and that allows you to typically advance the conversations a little bit further. Breaking the status quo is definitely challenging. I mean, people are, an old boss of mine said to me one time that people are in a box, they don't know they're in a box, and the directions for getting out of the box are written on the outside. My ad is that's a very warm, soft, fuzzy, comfortable place. They're used to doing things a certain way. And then back to him is that you've really got to come along and read the directions to them. And the same thing, holds true when you're talking to folks that are used to doing something in the government, is that you're trying to introduce something new. And whether it's the government, whether it's a prime, whether it's even on the commercial marketplace, you're trying to change up the equation here, and that can be difficult. And finally, I mentioned risk before, and a small business can be perceived as a risk. Some of the perceptions are that, you don't have the qualifications, you don't have the certifications, you don't understand, all the details of the requirements and the big picture. You may not have the funding. It may require more funding than you're going to get out of the SBIR, or even with the prime, particularly if you've got to set up a facility. So there's a number of issues that you may also have to overcome in the discussions as well. Okay, next slide, please. So I mentioned, understanding what's inside the customer's head. So part of that, we're going to start on the top left on research, is that, when you're selling something, we're typically told qualify, qualify, qualify. Is it real? What do we need to do to get it? Well, the same thing holds true in any of the research that you're doing. And, in terms of understanding the customer, understanding the budget, understanding what's out there. Glenn mentioned that sometimes it's difficult knowing exactly, what's going on in terms of a program of record, but there are hints and there are clues, and if you don't research them, you're never going to know. So that's one of the very key things that you need to do. In terms of discussion, we mentioned understanding users, issues and requirements before, and typically everybody has a problem, everybody has a need, everybody has a concern, everybody has an issue. We all do, and on the government side, theirs are somewhat amplified or magnified. And so the more homework you can do on the research side, the better able you are to discuss how your technology is a solution for their issues and their problems and all the things that they have on that side. Also, in terms of discussing where you need to go within the DoD, what you should probably do is kind of broaden your net a little bit, because what happens is sometimes if you're talking to one organization, there are other organizations out there that have similar needs or requirements, and there may be other organizations that have relationships that you don't have, but if you get to know those persons, they can also help you in getting into where you really want to go. So I find that networking in that sense, taking it and applying it to an SBIR type of level, does help in terms of getting the big picture and the lay of the land, and that will help. As far as adaptation, I mentioned going ahead and not just looking at how your technology as a whole can be applied to your product as a whole, but maybe some subset of it. And so what you've got to do is figure out where else it can be used or it can fit. And I had a client that had developed an avionics product, and it turned out that they were doing fairly well with it. They commercialized it on several aircraft platforms. But also, in what they had done, and again, I say this with the utmost credibility, in the process, they went ahead and had one component, and it was written up in the original topic. They had developed it also in the Phase I in terms of the design, and then also built it in the Phase II, and that turned into a separate product line within the family of products. And they ended up successfully getting a prime integrator to go ahead and bid it, and they've done extremely well for themselves, well into the 9 figures in terms of commercialization. So again, what I advise people to do is get out of the weeds and out of the muck and kind of get up to what maybe more of a 10,000-foot level and take a look at the big picture in terms of where else your technology or product can be applied. And finally, in terms of primes and programs of record, I'm coming more from the contractor side in terms of bidding on SBIRs and talking to primes. And Glenn had also mentioned that you need to go ahead and follow the money. And so it's not just a Jerry Maguire thing where show me the money, but you really do have to follow it. And there's ways to go ahead and research and look at the government budget, look for keywords. We're circling back around, I guess, to the research point here. But you can actually find out where the money is. One of the things that I found is I've always had, more often than not, I've been able to get a meeting with a prime or with a program office or something to go ahead and discuss a particular product or technology. Everybody, somebody is interested. Often a lot of people are interested, and they will go ahead and they will take a meeting. Problem is that you come out of there, you go, wow, that was a great meeting. This is going to be good. It's going to be great for us. And then nothing ever happens. And usually it's because of one or two things. Either they really didn't have the charter for what you wanted to do, or they don't have the money. So it is essential that you try to do that bit of homework as well, because then you'll find out that you can come out of there with definitive next steps to continue to progress things. And then, so one of the other things is that, again, as you're networking, doing your discussion, doing your research, you can probably find out a better background and more specific paths to move things along. And the other thing also, as you're doing all this, you're actually creating options for yourself. So if your plan A doesn't work, then you can go to your plan B or your plan C, but you're not going to go ahead and hit that wall and stop. You're going to be able to continue trying to find opportunities and create them for yourselves. And so again, in looking at this particular bullet, a lot of people try to go into the program offices. They they want to go talk to the PM himself, and typically they're busy, and it may be hard to get a meeting, but you have to find the right person in the office. And the other thing, I had another company that I've done some work with where they went into their the main program office, and they directed them to a prime. They said, if you really want to advance your technology, we're not going to buy it from you directly, but we are working through the prime, and they did a warm introduction. They've had some good telephone conversations and then meetings, and it seems to be moving along well. So again, definitely consider the prime contractors here as well. Next slide.
Great. And AJ, before we move on, Jandra, did you have any additional thoughts on knowing your customer?
I did. So my name is Jandra Shumskis, and I'm the founder of Cali Group. I have over 18 years experience supporting the DoD SBIR and STTR programs. So I've worked with specifically OSD, Army, Missile Defense Agency, and DARPA. And before being the founder of Cali Group, I was the director of the DoD Velociter program. First, I just want to say that the take home of this particular chart is to get out of the building and actually talk to people beyond the folks on your R&D team or your technical team. And a very useful tool to ensuring that you know your customer and that you are working on delivery of a solution that can be fielded by an end user is something as simple as the business model canvas. And anyone who doesn't know what that is or what that looks like or how to use it, you can use Google, type in BMC or business model canvas and look that up. But basically, that takes you through essentially validating the value prop or the value proposition of the technology that you're working on. And your value proposition is, why is your solution valuable to an end user? And how is it also valuable in terms of time and cost and even schedule? And then on the other side of the chart, it's figuring out who are the partners and stakeholders that can actually assist in being a champion for the technology to actually get it into a program of record or get it into the hands of an end user, be it on the DoD side or even in the commercial market side. So that is a tool that I highly suggest to help you move the needle and understanding your market positioning from both a DoD perspective and a commercial perspective, but also ensuring that the technology solution that you are working on will actually solve a contemporary problem. Next slide.
Great, and we'll turn it back to AJ to take us through more about understanding the problem. AJ, I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of understanding the problem, you really do have to do a little bit of dissection and introspection as well. So again, as I had mentioned before, it's not necessarily important what's in your head, but what's out there. And so typically, as there is a solicitation, for particular technologies that you're working on the SBIR, there are other solicitations, there are other bits of news articles and things that are and press releases that are getting put out that can also add to your knowledge base. So that's one of the things that you have to do. One of the things that as I recommend to folks, and this is not so much from the SBIR standpoint, but at least from a Phase I, Phase II, it gets more complex, and Phase III, it may be huge, is that you really do need to go back and dissect things. You really need to go take it apart, kind of go line by line, and make sure that you're covering all the requirements, but you're also understanding fully what the problem is. Another point that that relates to that is that you have to understand the concept of operation, how this is going to be employed. So you need to understand it both from a technology standpoint, you need to understand it from the user standpoint. So typically people come up again with a product that may work, but it may not work for the particular user that's there. So you've kind of missed the boat, and that really helps when you're trying to understand the problem or the challenge. So in terms of explaining it, there's a number of different ways to do that, but you have to pitch it in such a way that you're not just answering the technical requirement, but you're understanding the user requirement as well. So again, typically on the SBIR side, it's focused on the technology, but as you start moving forward into the Phase II and doing the transition, certainly the user aspect has to come out as well. So one of the things that I find also is that if you read through this, the requirement, and you now craft your solution, it sometimes helps to go ahead and read it to somebody, not just have them read your words, but read it to somebody and have them write down what they think they heard, because that'll end up telling you whether you're on track or you're missing the boat, and also you can look at the difference between what they've got down and what you said to make sure that you're not just stating the same facts back to them. It really does have to get put into your words. And then the other, again, the last point is definitely of merit, that if you really don't make sense, or it looks like you really don't understand the problem, you're just not going to have any interest on the part of the end DoD customer here. So And next slide, please. I think it's on to the next person.
Thank you, AJ. And with that, I want to turn over to Ray Friesenhahn from TechLink to take us through some of the best practices.
Well, thank you. This is Ray Friesenhahn, and I'm the SBIR and Technology Transition Manager for TechLink, which for the last 19 years has been DoD's primary nationwide partnership intermediary, working with all DoD components and all of their laboratories. One of the things we're just wrapping up right now is a study of 17,000 DoD Phase II SBIR and STTR awards that were awarded since 1995 to find out what happened, what were the economic outcomes of those awards. But we did an earlier one, a much smaller one, for the Air Force, where we only contacted the recipients of just over 4,500 of these Phase II awards, with a 96% response rate. And we looked at who were the most successful, which ones had the best outcomes in 7 different measures, 7 categories. And from those measurements, from those outcomes, we selected 104 companies for in-depth interviews. And we've just published a report. You'll get a link to this, but it's on our website, techlinkcenter.org, and you can go to our news and find it there, or just wait for the link later on when they send you the information about this. And there's some really great stuff on here in general for winning SBIR and for commercialization and transition. Next slide, please. This is a chart that shows what were the strategies used by the most companies for successful commercialization and transition. And if you look across here, you'll see that most of these are really just the standard advice given for any business. Like AJ was referring to earlier, know your customers. That's the most important thing of all. Communicate with the customer, certainly, that's very important. If you're a scientist or engineer who tends to be a little more shy about that, as you build your business, you might want to bring on a business development manager who's very successful, very good at communicating with the customer. Of course, having a strategy is important. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the partnering and the relationship building. There are certain relationships at any stage that can benefit you a lot. For Phase I, a lot of companies will work with university scientists just because of the credibility and research capability that builds. As has been said several times, working with prime contractors. They're out there, they're putting themselves out at the conferences to find good companies that they can work with for developing the new technologies. So look for them and try to develop a relationship with them. But one that a lot of people do not really think about and realize is working with the DoD laboratories. There are around 100 DoD labs, maybe 60, with very strong research capabilities out there. And they are connected to the end users, to the warfighters, to the program managers. And there is a process that you can do for a formal relationship, a cooperative research and development agreement, or a CRADA, that any of these federal laboratories can do. Sometimes you might have to pay a little bit of money for using their facilities and equipment. Sometimes it's just you put in your capabilities and it's no-cost CRADA. But the relationship that you build, the knowledge of the customer you can get out of this can be invaluable. So look into this. There's a list of the various laboratories and their technologies at our website. The Federal Laboratory Consortium, or FLC, has a search site for finding different federal labs that you could work with. But if you want to develop a relationship with a DoD customer, look at their labs and see if there are some research capabilities you might want to tap into and build that cooperative R&D agreement. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you, Ray. And now I'd like to turn over to Jim Sweeney from the Air Force to take us through a few more ideas.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. I'm Jim Sweeney with the Air Force Commercialization Readiness Program, and I'm stationed here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. All of the speakers so far have actually touched on a lot of what I've got, and you're probably going to see a lot of commonality in the discussion that we're having. But one of the biggest things that you can do as a small business trying to get involved with the government or any customer for that matter is you got to understand their mission, what keeps them up at night. And when you have a handle on what that is, then you're more prepared to settle back and kind of look at it and say, well, what is my core function? What do we do that's really our best capability? And then you match that with what your customer's looking for. And that's how you grow what your company's trying to do. A lot of this, I apologize if it sounds like I'm preaching to the choir, but it really does make a lot of sense. And one of the things that we've talked about several times already is, and I think it's worth repeating, is you have to build a network. And in the case of the Air Force, understand and know who is doing what. And everything that we're doing is solidly relationship-based. Once you have the relationship established, then as several of the other speakers have already mentioned, word of mouth can direct you towards other opportunities and possibilities for you to consider. Next chart, please. So the question is, well, gosh, I've heard all this, all the anecdotes on what we should be doing. There's a little bit of a secret on how to become successful, and what we've noticed is historically, it's the companies that get to know what the customer's looking for. Like I said, what keeps them up at night. If you're able to digest that and you're able to bring that back, you're going to be in a position where you've become a problem solver, and they're going to be looking to you to kind of guide them through the proverbial minefield, if you will, and you'll be able to grow your business. And one of the biggest things that we see a lot of companies struggling with is, from a user perspective, that would be the Air Force or any of the agencies that are participating in the SBIR program. There has to be a strong requirement. They have to have a real, no-kidding need, because once the need is established, then they have a funding source that's able to provide a way forward. And as was stated just like 15 minutes ago, you got to follow the money, and that's where the money is. Now, one thing about the SBIR program, it's a full-on contact sport. You're not going to get it by reading an email and trying to make the most of it. This is where you actually got to get out. You got to get to know. You got to touch your customer. You got to feel everything that he's feeling, they're feeling, so that as I've said already, it's what's keeping them up at night. How can you bring that solution to the fore? And there's a couple questions that you probably need to ask. One is, if I started from scratch, it'll take a long time to come up with a solution. Well, what if there was an opportunity to come in with potentially a more mature solution? Every year, there's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of SBIR topics that they've started and they ended up getting put on the shelf. What we're trying to do within the Air Force is try to convince some of the small guys to consider maybe picking up one of those Phase II SBIR topics and tailor it to the requirement that your customer's looking for, and then go at it, because now all of a sudden you're able to deliver something a lot faster. The typical process for a SBIR program just to get through a Phase 2 could be anywhere from 7 to 10 years. But if you pick up a mature topic for a Phase 2, like the second Phase 2, you could possibly reduce that to 18 to 24 months. And that's a big deal because that's where your money is. That's where you'll find you've actually recovering all of the effort that you've put into it. And that's really the goal of the SBIR program in the first place. So, and then the other one is, do I have a problem to solve, or am I bringing a solution looking for a problem? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a lot of the government folks as well as the industry folks to get beyond just the tech push and find a way for the technology pull. Because at that point, that's where somebody's actually paying for the technology. And then another one is, have you considered, and it was just mentioned a few moments ago, have you considered actually connecting the dots with a major defense contractor? That would be your Boeings, your Harris, your Raytheons, your Lockheeds. All of those folks, they have incredible programs. They're firmly entrenched with trying to find ways forward. And quite frankly, they cannot afford all of the technologies that the small businesses bring to the table. And where the small guys really step up is you tend to be more agile, a whole lot more flexible, a whole lot more cost efficient, and even better yet, you can make changes on the fly to where the Boeings, the Lockheeds, and this isn't anything disparagingly against them, but you can make changes a whole lot faster, and that raises your stock immensely with them, helping them solve their problems. Another one is, are you communicating with your customer frequently, like a lot? And there's a real thin line between, between being a pest and being persistent. You got to straddle that line really close. But that's what it takes, because when they have a problem and you've solved it before, they'll know who they're going to go talk with again, and that builds your credibility. Or even talk with another small business. Typically, you guys are struggling to find a couple nickels to rub against each other, but what would happen if you guys collaborated and brought a solution collectively? Well, then everybody's winning. The government gets the solution, and you guys get the business opportunities. Strongly recommend that. We've seen several instances in the past 4 to 5 years where the small guys have actually branched out to even have companies within the companies. It's pretty cool. Also, big thing, at the end of the day, everybody's looking for more money. Have you considered other funding sources than just the SBIR program? There's, you can get outside funding, and this kind of segues into my next chart. And next chart, please. And that is Phase 3. This is where the real money is. This is where you finally get to stretch your wings. This is where you're selling product, you're selling your service, you're selling the technology that you struggled so hard to come up with. Now is your opportunity, and you've got buyers lined up. Ideally, you've got somebody at the end of the line waiting with a check. Once you've developed your technology and you've proven that it works, you're looking for that guy that's going to provide some non-SBIR money. And this basically rolls back to the fact that once you've had a Phase 1 and a Phase 2 contract, you have satisfied the congressional language that states you have to compete the effort. You've already done that because you've won a Phase 1 and the Phase 2. So coming into a Phase 3, this should be a sole source buy to what you're doing. And so the verbiage that the congressional language states is work that derives from, extends, or completes an effort made under prior SBIR funding agreements. So once you've already done that, I would say pursue at the fastest rate that you can. Accelerate how you can get your technology done. It was also mentioned very effectively up front. We're encouraging the small businesses to accelerate when they can get their product to the market. because the champion that they've got in the Air Force and the others, they call them technical points of contact. That person could get promoted, he retires, or something else happens to that person. And if you're banking on everything that he's doing and he leaves, the next guy coming in probably won't have the same passion or be the advocate that that original person was. And we've seen instances, and it's sad to say, that the small businesses were basically the walking dead because nobody was going to buy their product and no one would even talk to them. So if you can find a way to accelerate your technology and find a way to get it sold, I would say that should be your course of battle on this thing. And so other than that, on the chart, which you'll have a copy on, we've also got a soft copy of the Phase 3 booklet. And the reason that we came up with that was we found that the contracting officers within the government are confused about what a Phase 3 is. The large guys are confused. The small guys didn't know what it was. And even the program managers weren't really aware of what a Phase 3 is. But the booklet is really intuitive, and I strongly encourage you to access the Air Force website and pick that up. Anyway, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Jim. This has been a really great discussion among everybody. Before we moved on to the panel portion, I wanted to see if any of our panelists had any additional thoughts. So the Army SBIR office, do you guys have any additional thoughts? Glenn, any final thoughts?
Hi, this is Glenn. I think I'll pass. I'm ready for questions.
Jim, any parting words?
No, I'm good as well. Thank you.
Jangela, any additional comments?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. As a participant in the SBIR and STTR programs, a common mistake is because you see a topic in the broad agency announcement that is articulating a problem that needs solving, there is kind of a pervasive myth or notion that if you solve the problem, you will have a customer at the end. And that's an inherently flawed assumption. A topic is a good way of getting a general overview of a type of problem or sore spot that's being experienced within DoD. But, and it's a funding opportunity if you have a solution that is appealing to one of the components. But that is only the beginning of your work when it comes to the commercialization or the transition of your technology into a program of record. And arguably, that's really a piece that you need to be thinking about upfront as you're looking at topics and as you're thinking about your solution. If you aren't engaging with the types of folks and entities that it's going to take to see your technology through at the very beginning, you're already late in the game if you're thinking about it at the end. So if it's not a part of a standard business practice to think about how you are going to get your technology to an end user, if you're not already thinking about that at the beginning, the best take-home advice that I can give to everyone on this workshop today is to incorporate that as a part of your proposal development strategy as you're putting together your technical solution. Who are the partners? Who are the champions? Who are the stakeholders that are going to be required to be your champion?
Got it. Thanks so much, Angela. Ray, anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, I want to make a couple of quick points. First, in terms of partnering, I've seen so many great technologies that died because the inventor, the business person, was not very good or effective at partnering. So that is a real key thing if you want to be successful in commercializing and transition of your technology. And part of that, too, is networking. Go to conferences that are relevant to your business, to your technology area. NDIA, the National Defense Industry Alliance, has some really good conferences people should look into. Regarding the defense laboratories, the partnerships you can develop with them through R&D. They can point you to opportunities besides SBIR you would never expect. So look into that if you can, because those relationships can be extremely useful. Now, in terms of background research, I like to suggest to people to look at the actual defense budget materials. The comptroller for Defense Department puts out RDT&E, Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation, budget justifications around February of each year. And there are real in-depth explanations of what these different programs are about, what they've done in past years, and where they expect to go with them. So if you download all the RDT&E budget justifications, you might find some really good opportunities for you. The acquisition programs, well, if you're doing development, you probably can't get into those, but if they're still doing development, those are great opportunities, and the more you understand about where it's going, the better off you will be.
Great, thanks so much. So we're now moving on to part 2 of today's discussion, our panel featuring transition practitioners to talk through some of the practical ways that you can advance your ability to transition. For this next portion, we've compiled some of the frequently asked questions that we received from SBIR, STTR program participants, and we'll ask directly to our panelists. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that if you have a question, please click on the blue question mark located at the top of the page, and we'll try to address it once we conclude with the panel. Finally, I'd like to request and remind each speaker to state their name, organization, and role prior to sharing their feedback. Next slide. So this first question is one we get a lot of times. The question is, what should companies include in their proposal to support transition? Glenn, let's begin with you. Any thoughts on this subject?
A few thoughts, and this is the one section of the proposal that I almost always read. Part of that's because the technology side of it I never understand, but this part, I've seen these elements in good proposals. Is one, you demonstrate that you know it, that you've done it before, and hopefully that is the case, that you have taken technology or products into the marketplace or some other way, and that always helps very well. It also is very good to be just clear and kind of, very to the point as to where your technology is going to be at the end of your SBIR program and what you think are the next steps to get into commercialization. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Jim, any thoughts on this from the Air Force perspective?
Yeah, hi, this is Jim Sweeney from the Air Force. One of the big things to understand is, the Air Force, we do quite well with our acquisitions and our technology, but you have to understand we don't have all the answers. And we have a real dire and very interest in how the small businesses contribute to what we're doing. So as you approach us, kind of come in with, I might have an idea after you've kind of listened to what we were talking about, like I said, what keeps us up at night. And I would say also when you're submitting your proposals, as was just stated by Glenn, it was, you got to give some indication that you've done this kind of work before. And what I personally look for when I'm going through a proposal is I'm looking for, for instance, AFSOC is interested in this product, and once it's developed, they have a need for X number of units or systems or whatever. You can provide those kinds of information. It gives us a better feel that you've been there, you've done it, and now you're ready to take it to the next step, and that really helps out a whole lot with your proposals. Thank you.
Thank you so much. D'Angelo, any thoughts from the Cali group side?
Sorry about that. I started talking while I was on mute. I guess what I would say is a good place to start, and I know this sounds like the overly obvious answer, is with the component-specific instructions in the DoD of the BAA. So I believe the current BAAs are in pre-release for both SBIR and STTR. So there's the DoD instructions and the component-specific instructions. In the DoD instructions, there is a baseline for what you should be including in a commercialization plan for the Phase I and Phase II proposals. In the component-specific instructions, several components actually parse out some additional requirements for that section of the proposal. And I would say that by and large, just for the basic considerations that you need to be making from a transition perspective, a lot of those questions can get you there. And then, of course, outside of the proposal is the work that you need to be doing from basically a validation perspective with partners and stakeholders.
Great, thanks so much. So our next question is, outside of SBIR, what other funding sources can companies use to bridge the value of debt? And this has been coming across a lot in the questions. AJ, you work a lot in the industry, but love to get your thoughts on this.
Well, there are literally a number of different BAA possibilities that are out there, depending upon where your technology is. If it's still relatively immature, say you ran into a problem as you were doing your Phase II, and you just could not get that thing matured out enough, there's different ones out there. DARPA, my experience from an industry standpoint, is that unless you have something that's revolutionary high risk and really back in the embryonic stage, it's not some place to really go to try to get BAA funds, although there are some special cases. But there's a number of other ones that are coming out, and all the different branches have them. And even occasionally, go take a look at Homeland Security, go take a look at DOT. If you've got a health thing, go look at HHS, because there are different funding opportunities there as well. Another one that a lot of people don't really realize is that there's a CTTSO, Counterterrorism Technical Support Working organization that every year they have a APBI, Advanced Planning Briefing to Industry. This year was came out in December, and then they put the solicitation out, in January, and I believe responses were due in, I want to say, February. So, and I have one company I was working with that pretty much ran through it. And it's actually very simple. It starts out with a quad chart. I think a lot of people know what those are. But it's a simple one-page thing. The next stage is a 12-page white paper, and then finally you move into the proposal stage. And but that's an area where if you have something that is relatively well thought out, it may not have the full maturity that you need, but it has the risk can be mitigated, identified, and mitigated, and it's got a high payoff value to the customer. That's one of the areas, for example, that you can go to. But there are just a number of them out there. Subscribe to FedBizOps, and identify, put in your keywords that you're looking for. And the only other thing that I would say in terms of funding sources is that goes back to what Ray had mentioned in terms of take a look at the government budget in terms of where they're looking to spend money, and look at the RDT&E plan. You can download that as a PDF, and then what you can do is do a keyword search in there. And so what you'll do is you'll also find the organizations that may also be putting out BAAs or otherwise, but at least it can kind of narrow your search. Back to you, Phil.
Great. I want to move on to the next question because we've been getting this question repeatedly throughout this webinar. The question is, how can companies enhance their relationships with DoD program managers and end users? And so for this one, because it's such a complex question, I'd like to go to everyone on this. Ray, I'd like to start with you and see if you have any thoughts on this one.
Well, again, part of the idea of developing the relationship, once you have the contact, is to communicate and do so in the best way. And I mentioned earlier that a A lot of us who have backgrounds as engineers and scientists don't do that very effectively. So try to bring someone into your company who can communicate very well and keep building those relationships and maintaining them. Someone who's capable to be your business development manager. The federal laboratories, again, can help you make other broader contacts beyond your immediate program manager. And, of course, the prime contractors. Boeing and Lockheed Martin put out lists during each DoD solicitation of people who are interested in specific topics and the companies that may be submitting SBIR proposals against those topics. Those prime contractors can provide great resources for you. They can be a subcontractor on your Phase II, for example, and eventually be your customer because they're likely to be developing the large systems that DoD is looking for. Okay, go ahead.
Great, thanks so much. Jim, would love to get your perspective from within the Air Force on the topic of getting relationships with the program managers and the end users.
Yeah, Jim Sweeney here. As I mentioned earlier, once you have your contact, there's always something that you can talk to them about. And if you're doing the research and you're developing that technology, there's always something that you can check with, and you can get back to your point of contact. Remember, he's a partner with you. He's looking for you to be successful because he's got a problem that you're trying to solve. And the real point here is, as I mentioned, communicate frequently, but not to the point of being a pest. But if he knows who you are, he'd be more inclined to discuss what he's looking to do. You just have to keep that door open. And as several of the other speakers have already said, you may just have to hire somebody that's fully versed in being communicative like that. And I think that that's your secret. Stay with them, and because he's always going to be looking for you to help him out. And also, if you're not talking with him, unfortunately I can say it for a fact in the Air Force, they change directions all the time, and they chase a bright shiny object and the next bright shiny object. And if you're not communicating with them, you've been derailed, and you have just no idea what he's looking for. At that point, you become no longer relevant. So you just have to communicate. It's a big deal. It's a lot bigger than it just looks like on a paper. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Jangela, any thoughts on this topic? I know you work with a lot of Phase II companies that are building these relationships.
So I have good news and bad news. I'll start with the bad news. It's not easy. If there were an easy way for companies engaged in the R&D side to easily engage with stakeholders and users, program managers, then I would probably be a gajillionaire just making those connections. I would say that they're kind of two formulaic things that you can do. The first is talk to the project sponsor, and based on my experience with these programs, access to, when I say the project sponsor, I mean your technical monitor, or your technical point of contact, or the topic author. And you generally can have access to these folks before you even submit a proposal, during the pre-release period, and also during the situs period for the BAAs. But once you have an award, hopefully you are having active conversations with your project sponsor, so your technical point of contact. And if you have a relationship, and hopefully you do, with this particular person, that person is your key. And you have to recognize that no question is answered if it's never asked. So as a small business, it is your job to ask those questions. Are there any program managers that I should be speaking to? Are there any primes or prime system integrators that I can be speaking to? And so outside of that particular leverage point, the other thing to do is attend the conferences that fall within your budget and make sense for you. And you have to do your outreach strategically. So if you know that there are going to be stakeholders definitely present at a particular event, then you really need to get out, you really need to get to that event and start talking to people and dotting the I's and crossing the T's and making those connections. So, the good news is you can find ways to get to these folks, but you have to do the work. It's not a natural process, and it's not a Google search either. Most of the programs of record within DoD, you can't find on Google. So you really have to do your homework, and you really need to build your relationships.
Thanks, Angela. And you've actually brought up a really good point that I was hoping I could direct to Glenn. Glenn, we've been getting a lot of questions specifically about the TPOCs and their role in the commercialization process. And so, Glenn, was curious if you could provide a slight variation of this question, but how should companies work with TPOCs as they move toward transition?
Okay, so the TPOC, of course, is the technical point of contact, the person that generates the topic originally. I guess that's what you're talking about, Philip, right? Or sometimes it's the technical guy on a contract. So if it's,
correct.
I'm going to assume that a company that has an SBIR contract probably has a pretty good relationship with their COR and the technical staff on that contract. So take advantage of that. I guess what I would like to say is put a little emphasis on all the SBIR awardees. Take advantage of your SBIR programs, the Technical Assistance Program in the Army or the CRP program or whatever service offers, because each of the services has a group out there that is looking at basically the whole spectrum of programs within their service and communicating with the R&D advocates within the organizations. And so look to us, ask us for help in reaching into an organization which you have no visibility or no experience on. Thank you.
Great, thanks for those comments. I want to move to the next question that we have, which is how can companies better align their development process with the acquisition process? AJ, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, a few. One of the things that, well, I've seen several things, but one of them in terms of looking at the acquisition process is you really need to understand where your development fits in. And typically, a lot of companies are heads down, kind of working, trying to develop things on their own, but they're not really picking their head up and looking at where their path is going to go ahead and take them. So there has to be some alignment between what they're doing and where they need to go. And so I would, some companies, they can multitask quite well, and they have somebody taking a look at that. And if you have really good interaction with your TPOC and the other folks that you're talking to on the SBIR side, on the government side, then they can help steer you or guide you or direct you. Other times, it's going to fall upon yourself, so you're going to have to go ahead and either the person that's doing the work is going to have to be cognizant of that, or they're going to have to assign somebody to kind of go ahead and map the two out. And so with that, if you know that you're going to be going and fitting into, say, something for the F-35 at the end of, the SBIR program, going back to the relationship building part that we were talking about in terms of the program office, getting to know those folks, dealing with the primes, and starting to insert yourself a little bit early, and that way you can probably minimize the gap that you're going to have in terms of transitioning. So, but also if you understand where they're going with their program, you're going to find out probably well in advance whether there is a fit and a nice smooth handshake in terms of rolling into that, or what you may find out is they may not have even considered you at this stage, but you may be able to go ahead and kind of start getting inserted. So that's one of the things. Again, it looks at part of the relationship building, but also looking at what the steps are in terms of the transition and the timing. And I'll also throw out the funding, because if there is no funding for what you're trying to bring there, then you're going to have that gap and that valley of death, and you're going to be sitting around twiddling your thumbs and waiting for the next thing to happen. Back to you, Phil.
Great, thank you, AJ. Jangela, any thoughts on this subject, how to better align the development process and the acquisition process?
I really think AJ hit the nail on this, but again, I'm starting to sound like a broken record. The best way to do this is to get out and talk to people. If you're trying to do this by yourself, using search functions, or just going off of collateral that might be out there, you're already doing yourself a disservice. So I believe it was either Jim or Glenn earlier that was talking about the various transition assistance and commercialization readiness programs that are out there at the service levels. Leverage them.
Got it. And we'd like to move on to the last question, which is, I want to talk about success stories. This is a great way for, I guess, us as the SBIR community to learn what's been successful, how the company transition, and I really want to understand the critical factors that drove that success. And so, Ray, I know TechLinks just wrapped up another great report around transition. Would love to hear any success stories you all heard or learned about, and what do you think was the critical factors in making those successful?
Well, for each success story, there's a whole lot of different factors, and it all depends on things like the technology, the individuals, where they start from. We have something like 24 videos, short videos of 5 minutes or less, on our website on many of the Air Force successes, and there's some of those written in that best practices, I think 14 success stories. But the things that lead people to success include, not just their capability, their driving passion. One of the success stories, VitaCare, where they developed a life-saving infusion device. The guy had a friend who was killed in a wreck, and they could not get any infusion into his veins, and he came up with an alternative process and pushed so hard that he was giving these devices away to the military when he couldn't even figure out how to get through a procurement process. So that kind of passion really led Larry Miller with VitaCare to become very, very successful, and eventually sold his company for quite a bit of money as a humanitarian. There's others. Qualcomm is held up as a great success story. There's another company, Broadcom, that a few of you may have heard of. A large part of their capability in terms of wireless GPS on a chip was developed by an Iranian refugee who started a company, and we'll be developing a success story about that one and have more information about that in the near future. But the Iranian refugee and his sister were recently named among the top innovators in the world at the end of last year. So if you look for the top innovators, you'll see Mariam and Reja Rofagaran, forgive me for getting the names a little messed up, but they are a tremendous success story now with something like 1,500 patents between them. So look at that passion, find your passion, and make those connections to carry you forward.
Great, thanks for that. Glenn, before we move on, any success stories from the Army that you think would be good for the group to understand, and what sort of drove those successes?
Yeah, I just have one that I'd like to share with you, because, of course, we can't really share the names. So, but we have one company right now is just ending up a Phase II, and they were able to, when they put together their proposal strategy, to put in an operational demonstration with, and of course they had to get somebody to pull that off for them from the Army side, but they put in an op demo as part of what they were going to do. So as they reached the end of their Phase II contract, they now had an Army lieutenant colonel and his staff participating, in an op demo for for a product which was ultimately going to go into their portfolio. And it was incredibly successful as terms of the strategy.
Glenn, that's a great example. Jim, didn't know if you had anything to share from the Air Force perspective before we moved along.
Yeah, we've had quite a few successes, and one of the things that we do for our successes is we pursue them so that we can get them on video. We videotape them, we put the technologist, we put the developer, and the intent is so that we can get the story in front of Congress. Congress doesn't have time to read any of the paper documents that go in front of them, but they certainly have time to do the 2 to 5 minute videotape. And we've had one company, for instance, they built jet engines, and Boeing and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman are all competing to actually incorporate that particular product into platforms that used to only go like about 125 miles. Now they've got range that goes well beyond 700 miles. For whatever reason, they would need that. But the company listened to what the problem statement was, and they engaged and they stayed attached to what the Air Force and the Navy and all the others are doing, but they also reached out to the major defense contractors. And that was the secret to their success. And they've been great. Coolest place I've ever seen. You go to this house, this innocuous house north of Detroit. It's a ranch house, and there's this really cool-looking garage behind it. It's a 2-story garage, and it has the most incredible man cave you ever seen. It's a fully instrumented engine test facility, and they actually run these engines out in the middle of nowhere. Really cool company, and they're very personable, and they're great to work with. If you could be one of those, that type of a company, you'll be hugely successful. Thank you.
Thank you. And so with that, I'd like to move on to closing comments in the interest of time. And so thanks everyone for giving us the time, and thank you for everyone for your thoughts thus far. I wanted to see if any of our panelists had any additional comments before we close this portion of the webinar. Jim, I know you just spoke, but any parting words?
Yeah, the real issue here is what you're doing is not intuitive. It's a really difficult path. And the fact that you're brave enough to step along that line, that's huge. You guys are heroes. We really look forward to the small business guys. Find a way to make a connection with somebody in the Air Force. We even defer them over to talking with DARPA. We talk with the Navy all the time. It's not just us. If you have something that fits, we're more than really glad to have you talk with somebody else. The Air Force even has a group of folks that specifically are aligned to make that connection for you. As was stated, come to our outreach events, come to our Small Business Industry Day and our technical interchange meetings. That's where you make the connections. Remember, it's a relationship and it's a contact sport. Wish you all the luck and all the best to you.
Thank you. Glenn, any parting words?
That was good, what you just heard. My last thing I'd like to say is when you're trying to build relationships, remember that the DoD research and engineering groups and the R&D labs and all of that are scientists and engineers, and they love to hear what you guys are doing. You can use that as your leverage to get your foot in the door to talk to almost anybody.
Awesome. AJ, anything before we leave?
Yeah, I guess the other thing, going back to the relationships and the PMs and the users, is start early. Start when you're doing your phase one. Start even when you're doing your phase one proposal. And during the whole course of that time, maintain the relationship, ask questions, because if you actually have the input from users as you're going along through the phase one and the phase two, and then you're developing the relationships even in advance with the program managers and the primes, that'll facilitate things later on, instead of suddenly you pop out of nowhere and expect miracles to happen. So again, do your homework, and don't be afraid of going out there and networking and introducing yourself to people.
Great, thanks so much, AJ. Ray, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for participating. And when you are talking to a customer, a potential customer, keep in mind you don't want to be pushing your product at them. You may be very proud of it, but what you really want to be doing is listening to them, finding out what their pain points are, where they need some help, that your capabilities, your technology may be able to help them. And you can go so much further that way by listening to the customer and their needs. And don't forget, there's a lot of help out there. There's a nationwide network of procurement technical assistance centers, or PTACs, that can provide you a lot of free help in looking for these BAAs and other opportunities. If you do have something that's ready to sell, as well as just looking for R&D opportunities. And if you're working with prime contractors, you may want to look to the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, the MEPs. There's some of those assistance centers in every state, I believe, that are networked through NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And for example, they can help you with ISO certification, which may be very important if you're going to be working with and supplying product to a prime contractor who wants your small business to have the capability and certifications that they need to supply to the Defense Department. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Jangela, any final words?
I want to echo some of the sentiments from Jim Sweeney with the Air Force. Small businesses, especially those that are working with the DoD SBIR and STTR programs, really are the champions of technology. You guys are the ones that are willing to take on sometimes what seems like unsurmountable risk. And so for that, I applaud each and every one of you on a daily basis. And just being able to, in a highly competitive process, to get to phase two, to now be focused on moving your technology forward, it just really speaks volumes about each and every one of you. I also want to echo some of Ray's sentiments from TechLink regarding resources. It's a lot. Moving your technology into the hands of the warfighter or into the commercial market is not a solo endeavor. So use the resources referenced here. I know in a couple of weeks, the DoD SBIR program is going to have a resource page up. And so we'll make sure that everyone on this call gets a link to that. But use the resources that are out there. Put in the work to use those resources. And finally, be a good storyteller when it comes to your technology and your value proposition. If no one can understand why your solution is valuable, then you're doing a lot of work and doing a lot of running without getting a lot of results. So before you get out there and start pitching and talking to folks, make sure that you can really articulate within 5 minutes what the value of your product or technology is. And thanks again for your service to the warfighter and just for being awesome.
Thanks so much, Angela. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their participation for a wonderful discussion. I'd now like to introduce Jason Talley, the BiteCube Training and Advocacy Project Manager, to take us through the upcoming workshops in this series and next steps.
All right, thanks a lot, Phil. And once again, thank you, panelists, and thank you for everybody that's on the line. I know we're running a little bit over, but I think this was very valuable to everybody. And also, do know that we had a lot of questions that we were not able to address during the call, and we will have our Q&A follow-up. So if you're on that mailing list, you will get that information, and also a transcript and a link to the video to rewatch that and share it with your constituents. Coming up on May 24th, we have our DOD SBIR submission site and proposal considerations, and also using Citus. And they'll be coming directly from our BiteCube team who run that site, so they'll be able to walk you through that process. Also on June 5th, managing intellectual property. We'll talk about the considerations for small businesses. On June 26th, understanding the evaluation process and what to do with the debrief. And also on July 17th, working with prime contractors. So stay tuned for that, and definitely want your participation. Also, please remember to take our survey afterwards. Your feedback is very important to us. And also, if you have any questions, please do hit us up at SBIR@bitecube.com. Once again, that's SBIR training@bitecube.com. All right, good luck, everybody, and we'll see you in a few weeks.